David Connolly arrived at the Hawthorne Grand Ballroom at 6:40 in the evening, parked his 11-year-old pickup truck 3 blocks away because the valet lot didn't allow staff vehicles near the entrance, and walked the rest of the way carrying his uniform jacket over his arm so it wouldn't wrinkle. He was 36 years old, built lean from years of climbing scaffolding and crawling through mechanical rooms, with short dark hair beginning to gray at the temples and a permanent crease between his eyebrows that made him look like he was always solving a problem, because he usually was. He wore his valet uniform, black slacks, white shirt, a maroon vest with the hotel's gold insignia stitched above the pocket, and underneath it, though no one would ever see it, a faded gray t-shirt from a fire safety certification course he'd completed 7 years earlier, back when he still had an office and a salary and a wife who packed his lunch. The Hale Foundation Gala was the kind of event David had parked cars for a dozen times that year. Men in tuxedos that cost more than his monthly rent. Women in gowns that swept the marble floor. Ice sculptures shaped like swans, melting slowly under heat lamps nobody had bothered to turn off. He didn't resent it, not exactly. He noticed things, that was simply how his mind worked, cataloging details whether he wanted to or not. And what he noticed that night was that the kitchen exhaust fan above the east service entrance was running at half capacity, making a faint grinding sound that nobody else seemed to hear. He filed it away. It wasn't his job anymore to fix things like that. His job tonight was to take keys, say "Yes, ma'am," and "Right away, sir," and bring a Bentley around without scratching it. At 7:15, Victoria Hale's car pulled up to the entrance. Not a Bentley but a matte black SUV with tinted windows, driven by her usual chauffeur, who got out first to open the rear door before the valet team could reach it. David stepped forward anyway, hand extended for the chauffeur's keys, the routine motion of 100 identical nights. Victoria Hale emerged in a deep emerald dress, sharp-shouldered and severe in the way expensive tailoring could be. Her dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked like it might never move again. She was 42, founder and CEO of Halcyon Aerospace Systems, a woman whose face had been on 3 magazine covers that year for reasons that had nothing to do with kindness. Behind her, a boy climbed out of the car slowly, reluctantly, the way children do when they've been told to behave at an event they don't want to attend. The boy was 8 years old, thin for his age, with sandy hair that fell over his forehead and a navy blazer that looked borrowed from a catalog rather than chosen by him. He kept his eyes down until he reached the curb, and then, for reasons David didn't understand yet, the boy looked up directly at him and froze. David didn't think much of it. Kids stared sometimes. He reached for the chauffeur's offered keys, said the line he'd said all night, "I'll have this brought right back around for you, ma'am." And that was when Victoria Hale turned and actually looked at him for the first time, her eyes moving from his face down to his shoes and back up again, the particular kind of inspection people performed when they were deciding how much attention someone deserved. "You're new," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am. I've worked the last 4 Hale events. I don't recognize you." David said nothing to that, because there was nothing useful to say. He held the door for her son instead, and the boy hesitated on the threshold, glancing back at David with an expression that didn't belong on an 8-year-old's face, something closer to recognition or fear or both. "Caleb," Victoria said sharply, and the boy moved. Inside, the gala proceeded as galas did. Champagne towers. A string quartet playing arrangements of songs that were never meant to be played by string quartets. David's shift technically ended at the valet stand, but the event coordinator, a tired, overworked woman named Renata who liked David because he was reliable and never complained, had asked him to also help bus tables during the dinner service, since 2 of the contracted waitstaff had called in sick. He didn't love the extra hour, but it meant an extra $40, and $40 meant Mia's shoes for the spring recital, the pair with the small heel that she'd been asking about for 3 weeks. He moved quietly between the tables in his vest, clearing empty glasses, refilling water, doing the kind of work that made him invisible to almost everyone in the room. He passed Victoria Hale's table twice without incident. The third time, his sleeve brushed against a wine glass that had been placed too close to the table's edge. Not knocked, not spilled, simply brushed, and a single drop of red wine landed on the white tablecloth near Victoria's place setting. She set down her fork. "Excuse me," she said, in a voice pitched precisely to carry to the surrounding tables without seeming to try. Do you know how much this tablecloth costs to replace? Do you know who rented this room? I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll get a server to handle it right away. I don't want an apology. I want competent staff. She looked at him again, the same up-and-down assessment from the valet stand, except now there was an audience, and audiences changed people. Is this what passes for service now? Is this the best the hotel could find? A few heads at nearby tables turned. David felt the heat rise in his neck but kept his hands steady, reaching for a napkin to blot the stain before it set. It won't happen again. It already happened. That's the problem with people like you. You're always one step behind the moment something matters. She said it lightly, almost bored, the cruelty so casual it barely registered as cruelty to her. What is it you do when you're not failing to clear a table? It was a question designed to humiliate, and David understood that, understood the rules of the game well enough not to play it. This is my job tonight, ma'am. Tonight. So you have other jobs. Of course you do. She gestured vaguely, the gesture of someone used to an audience agreeing with her. I'm sure you're very busy juggling whatever it is you juggle. Some of us built things that last. Some of us just show up wherever there's an opening. A small ripple of laughter came from one of the men at her table, the kind of laughter that exists to please the person who told the joke rather than because the joke was funny. David said nothing. He finished blotting the stain, set the napkin aside, and stepped back from the table, the practiced retreat of a man who had learned, over several hard years, that dignity sometimes meant simply leaving a room before you said something you couldn't take back. It was at that exact moment that Caleb, sitting 2 seats from his mother, set down his own fork and said, quietly, almost too quietly for anyone to hear over the quartet, "Mom, he's the one who saved my life." Victoria turned to her son with the particular impatience of a parent interrupted mid-performance. "What did you say?" But Caleb had already gone still, staring at his plate, as if he'd said something he hadn't meant to say out loud, and the moment passed the way moments do at crowded tables, swallowed by conversation, by the clinking of glasses, by a waiter refilling water 2 seats down. Victoria gave her son a brief, distracted look, decided it was nothing, and returned to her dinner. David, 3 tables away by then, hadn't heard the words at all. He had no idea anything had been said. He only knew that his face was hot, that his hands hadn't quite stopped shaking, and that he had 40 more minutes left on his shift and a daughter waiting for him at his sister's apartment who didn't yet know how her father had spent his evening. He didn't think about the boy again that night. He had no reason to. Mia Connolly was 7 years old, with her mother's wide brown eyes and her father's habit of asking questions until she understood exactly how something worked. She lived with David in a 2-bedroom apartment 11 minutes from his sister Carol's place, in a building with thin walls and a landlord who fixed things slowly, which didn't bother David much since he could usually fix them himself. Mia had one object she carried everywhere. A small brass compass, scratched and slightly dented, that had belonged to her mother. Her mother had died when Mia was 4, an aneurysm with no warning, the kind of loss that arrived on an ordinary Tuesday and never fully left. Mia didn't remember much about her mother directly anymore, but she remembered the compass, because David had given it to her on her 5th birthday and told her it had been in her mother's coat pocket the day they met. Mia kept it in the front pocket of whatever she was wearing, and at night, before sleep, she would hold it flat in her palm and watch the needle settle, as if confirming that the world still had a direction, that things still pointed somewhere even when they felt lost. When David picked her up from Carol's that night, just after 10, Mia was already half asleep on the couch, the compass loose in her hand. He carried her to the car without waking her fully, the familiar weight of her against his shoulder a kind of relief after the evening he'd had. "Bad night?" Carol asked, walking him to the door. "Long one," he said, which was as much as he usually offered. "You know you don't have to keep doing this. The valet thing. I can help more." "You help plenty," David said. "I've got it." He didn't tell her about Victoria Hale. There wasn't a version of that story that didn't sound like complaining, and David had never been a man who complained, not even when he probably should have. He drove home with Mia buckled into the back seat, the city lights sliding past the windows, and when they got home he carried her to her room, set her down gently on the bed, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. She stirred, half waking. "Did you fix anything tonight?" It was a question she asked often, a small ritual between them, because she knew her father liked fixing things, and she liked hearing about it even when she was too tired to stay awake for the answer. "Not tonight," David said. "Just carried some glasses around." "That's still helping," Mia mumbled, already drifting again. "Helping's the same as fixing." He sat with her another minute, the way he did most nights, until her breathing evened out completely. Then he went to the kitchen, made himself a cup of instant coffee he didn't really want, and sat at the small table going through a stack of mail bills, mostly, and one envelope from a community college continuing education program offering a refresher course in fire protection engineering. A trade he'd been certified in once, before the company he'd worked for folded during a round of corporate consolidation 3 years earlier, and he'd never quite found his way back into the field. He looked at the envelope for a long moment, then set it aside the way he set aside most things he wanted but couldn't currently afford, not abandoned, just postponed. He hadn't planned on returning to the Hawthorne Grand the next evening. But Renata called him at 4 in the afternoon, her voice tight with the particular stress of an event coordinator managing a problem she didn't yet understand. "David, I know this is short notice, but the Hale Foundation extended the gala into a second night. Some kind of investor follow-up dinner, smaller group, maybe 60 people. We're short-staffed again. I know you worked last night and I know you've got Mia, but I'll pay you double if you can do 3 hours. David thought about the envelope on his kitchen table, about Mia's recital shoes, about the math that never quite balanced no matter how carefully he did it. "I can do 3 hours, he said. "I'll need to be out by 10. "You'll be out by 10. I promise." He dropped Mia at Carol's again, feeling the small guilt of it, the particular guilt of a parent who has to keep choosing between presence and provision, and arrived at the Hawthorne Grand a little before 7, the same uniform, the same vest, his face carefully arranged into the same blankness he used for difficult clients. The second night was smaller and stranger. Fewer guests, more boardroom energy than gala energy, men in dark suits speaking in low voices about quarterly projections and supply chain resilience. Victoria Hale was there again, this time without the emerald dress, dressed instead in a charcoal suit that made her look even more like the kind of person used to being the only woman in a room and treating that fact as an achievement rather than a circumstance. Her son was there too, seated at a small table near the kitchen entrance with a tutor, doing homework while the adults conducted business, clearly an arrangement made because there had been nowhere else to leave him. David didn't approach their section if he could avoid it. He worked the far side of the room, refilling glasses, clearing plates, watching the kitchen exhaust fan continue its grinding half-speed rotation that nobody else seemed to register. It bothered him more on the second night. It was the kind of sound that, in his old line of work, would have triggered an inspection report and a maintenance order before the night was through. Reduced airflow in a commercial kitchen during active service wasn't a minor issue. It meant heat and grease vapor weren't venting properly. It meant risk was accumulating in a place nobody was watching. He mentioned it, briefly, to one of the hotel's own banquet staff, a young server named Theo. "Hey, you guys had anyone look at the kitchen exhaust today? It's running rough." Theo shrugged. "Maintenance guy's out sick. They said it's fine for tonight." David let it go. It wasn't his building. It wasn't his job. He told himself that twice, which was usually a sign he didn't quite believe it. At 8:50, he was crossing near the kitchen's service entrance with a tray of empty glasses when he smelled it. Not smoke exactly, but something close, an acrid edge under the smell of seared meat and butter, the particular smell of grease vapor building past its normal threshold in a space with insufficient ventilation. He set the tray down on a side table and pushed open the kitchen door. Inside, 2 line cooks were working a high-volume service, flames rolling under pans, the air thick with a haze that should have been pulled out through the exhaust hood and wasn't. The grinding sound from the fan motor had changed, slower now, straining, the unmistakable sound of a motor working against a load it could no longer manage. Above one of the back burners, where a pan of oil had been left slightly too long, a thin curl of black smoke was rising directly into unfiltered air. "Hey, turn that burner off," David said. His voice suddenly different, flatter, carrying an authority that hadn't been part of his valet persona all night. The nearest cook glanced at him, confused. A man in a maroon vest wasn't who gave orders in a kitchen. But something in David's tone made him obey anyway, snapping the burner's control to off. "Where's your fire suppression panel?" David asked. "What?" "The hood suppression system. Where's the panel?" The cook pointed, bewildered, toward a small metal box mounted near the kitchen's exit, half hidden behind a stack of delivery crates. David moved to it immediately, scanning the readout, a manual pull station for the kitchen's wet chemical suppression system, the kind required by code above every commercial cooking line, the kind that was supposed to be inspected twice a year and clearly hadn't been, judging by the dust on the casing and a faint corrosion line along one hinge. He didn't pull it yet. Pulling a suppression system meant dumping fire-suppressing chemical across every active cooking surface in the kitchen, ending service for the night and likely costing the hotel thousands in ruined food and downtime. It was the right move if there was an actual fire. It was an overreaction if there wasn't. He turned instead to the exhaust hood itself, listening, watching the smoke pattern, doing the kind of rapid risk assessment that had once been his entire profession and that his body still remembered even after 3 years away from it. The motor was failing, not yet dead. The smoke was building because the hood couldn't pull volume fast enough, not because flames had reached anything beyond the pan. There was a window, narrow but real, to correct the problem without triggering full suppression and the chaos that would follow. "I need everyone off these 4 burners," David said, already moving toward the exhaust hood's control panel on the wall, a panel he understood instantly despite never having seen the specific building system, because the logic of these systems was the same everywhere, designed by people trained the way he'd been trained. Cut power to the exhaust fan circuit for 10 seconds, then restart it on the secondary breaker. The motor's overloading and tripping into a failure state under sustained draw. If we don't reset it now, in about 90 seconds you're going to have grease vapor ignition above that back line, and then I'm pulling the suppression system whether you like it or not. The head chef, alerted by the commotion, pushed through from the prep area, already furious at the interruption. "Who is this? Get him out of my kitchen." 60 seconds, David said, not raising his voice, not looking away from the panel. "You can throw me out after." Something in his calm, the specific, unhurried calm of a man who had done this before and survived it, made the chef hesitate just long enough. David found the breaker panel exactly where 2 decades of standardized commercial kitchen code required it to be, flipped the exhaust circuit off, counted 10 seconds against his own pulse, and flipped it back on, this time onto the panel's secondary load path rather than the overloaded primary. The fan above them changed pitch immediately, the grinding sound vanishing, replaced by a smoother, fuller draw, visibly pulling the haze of smoke and vapor upward and out within seconds. The thin curl of smoke over the back burner thinned, then disappeared. The kitchen went quiet except for the hum of the now-functioning exhaust system and the distant string quartet beyond the door. David exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders in a way no one in the room understood yet. "Get someone to actually service that motor before tomorrow's service," he said to the chef, his voice returning to something closer to its usual flatness. "It's been running on one of 2 windings for a while now. That's why it sounded wrong. It would have failed completely within the hour, and with a load like this, the suppression panel hasn't been inspected in what looks like over a year. Whoever signs off on your fire code compliance needs to know that." He picked his abandoned tray of glasses back up from the side table outside the kitchen door, as if nothing unusual had happened, and went back to work. He didn't know that Caleb Hale had slipped away from his tutor's table during the commotion, drawn by the noise and the smell of smoke, and had been standing in the kitchen's swinging doorway the entire time, watching. Renata found out about the incident roughly 20 minutes later, when the chef, shaken but professionally honest, pulled her aside to explain why the kitchen had nearly shut down and why it hadn't. "Your valet," the chef said, "the one who's been here both nights. He knew exactly what he was doing back there. Saved us a full suppression dump and probably a kitchen fire." Renata found David near the bar, refilling a water pitcher, and pulled him a few steps aside. "What happened in the kitchen?" "Exhaust fan was failing. I reset it before it became a problem." "How do you know how to do that?" David hesitated, the old reflex of not wanting to explain himself, the same instinct that had kept him quiet the night before when Victoria Hale asked him what he did for a living, as if the answer would confirm whatever she already believed about him. "I used to do fire protection engineering. Commercial systems. Before. Before what? Before the company folded. Renata studied him for a long moment, recalculating something behind her eyes. 3 years of seeing David Connolly take coats and park cars and never once mentioning that he'd once been the kind of person hotels paid consulting fees to in order to keep their guests alive. David, that's not a small thing. Why have you been parking cars? Bills don't care what you used to do, David said simply and went back to refilling the pitcher, because that conversation, like most conversations about his old life, didn't lead anywhere useful and he had 30 minutes left on his shift and a daughter to pick up. What David didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Caleb Hale had a very specific reason for going still at the sight of him on the very first night. A reason that had nothing to do with smoke or kitchens. For months earlier, in late spring, Victoria Hale had taken Caleb to the Hale family's lake property for a long weekend, one of the rare stretches of time she carved out of a calendar otherwise consumed by board meetings and investor calls. Caleb had gone down to the dock alone in the late afternoon while his mother took a call inside. Against the rules, the way children sometimes do when the rules feel very far away and the water looks very inviting. He had slipped on the dock's edge reaching for a half-submerged toy boat, gone into water that was colder and deeper than he expected, and within seconds the current beneath the dock, fed by a narrow channel that fed the lake, had pulled him under and away from the ladder. He remembered very little of it clearly. He remembered cold, and the strange muffled silence of being underwater, and panic that didn't feel like the panic in movies, slower and heavier, like trying to scream through water itself. He remembered, more clearly than anything else, a hand closing around his arm, and then his collar, and then air, sudden, shocking, blinding air, and a man's voice close to his ear, steady, unhurried, saying, "I've got you. Breathe. You're all right. I've got you." Over and over, the way you talk to someone you'd known your whole life rather than a stranger pulled from a lake. The man, David, though Caleb hadn't known his name then and didn't make the connection at first because a man in fishing waders by a lake looked nothing like a man in a maroon vest at a gala, had been renting a cabin 2 properties down for a rare weekend off, the kind of trip he almost never took, paid for with money he'd been saving toward Mia's recital costume before deciding, just once, that he and his daughter both needed 2 days somewhere with trees. He'd heard the splash from where he was fishing off a neighboring dock, recognized immediately by the particular quality of the silence that followed that something was wrong, and was in the water within seconds, pulling Caleb up by instinct and training that had nothing to do with his current job and everything to do with the man he'd been before it. He'd carried Caleb to shore, performed a quick check for water in the lungs, wrapped him in his own jacket, and stayed with him until Victoria, alerted by a neighbor's frantic knocking, came running down from the house in bare feet, her phone still in her hand mid-call. David had handed Caleb to her, confirmed the boy was breathing normally and alert, recommended she still have him checked by a doctor as a precaution, declined her offer to call the police to document a hero, declined her attempt to get his name for some kind of formal thank you, and said only, "I'm glad I was close enough to hear it. Take care of him," before walking back down the shoreline to where Mia was waiting, oblivious, building something out of pine cones on their own rented dock. He had never told Mia what happened. He had never mentioned it to Carol. It hadn't felt like a story that needed telling. To David, it was simply what you did when you heard a splash and a silence that followed wrong. He had no idea the boy's name was Caleb, no idea the mother in bare feet was Victoria Hale, no idea their paths would cross again 4 months later across a catering tray in a ballroom. Caleb had spent the drive home from the lake trying to describe the man to his mother, but Victoria, distracted by the medical scare and 3 missed calls from her board, had absorbed it as a single fact. A stranger helped, a crisis resolved, life continuing, rather than a face to remember. Children, in her experience, recovered from things adults didn't have time to fully process. She had moved on. Caleb had not. The 3rd night did not exist on Renata's schedule, but it existed anyway because Victoria Hale, informed by the chef, by 2 board members who'd overheard the kitchen story, and finally, hesitantly, by her own son who could no longer hold the connection inside himself, asked Renata to arrange one final, smaller gathering. A private dinner, same ballroom, a fraction of the original guest list, ostensibly to formally thank the hotel staff for their work across the gala weekend. Renata, sensing something larger than a thank you dinner, called David and asked if he could come in one more time, this time as a guest rather than staff, an invitation that confused him enough that he almost said no. A guest. She specifically asked for you, David. By description, since nobody had your name written down properly. Said it was important. He went, reluctantly, in the only suit he owned, the one he'd worn to his wife's funeral and, before that, to his own wedding, a dark gray with a tie Carol had picked out for him because he never trusted himself with ties. He brought Mia because Carol had a late shift that night and there was nowhere else for her to be, and because some instinct told him this dinner, whatever it actually was, might be one his daughter should see the end of. The ballroom, when they arrived, held no more than 20 people. The chef, the kitchen staff from that night, Renata, 2 board members, and Victoria Hale, seated near the head of a single long table with Caleb beside her. The boy saw David enter and stood up immediately, without being told to, crossing the room before his mother could stop him. "You're the man from the lake," Caleb said, looking up at David with the particular directness only children manage. "You saved me. I told my mom it was you. I'm sorry I didn't say it right the first time. I was scared to say it too loud." David went very still, the pieces of 2 separate nights finally locking into place. The boy's strange stare on the first evening, the half-finished sentence he'd never heard, the lake in early spring, the boy he'd carried out of cold water 4 months earlier now standing in front of him in a hotel ballroom in a different city wearing a different blazer. "You're—" He looked down at the boy properly for the first time, seeing past the formal clothes to the same face he'd held steady against his shoulder on a dock in spring. "You're all right. You're doing all right." "I'm okay," Caleb said. "I think about it sometimes. The water. But I'm okay." Victoria Hale rose from her seat slowly, and when she crossed the room toward David, there was none of the certainty in her walk that had carried her across the ballroom floor 2 nights earlier. She stopped a few feet from him, glanced once at Mia, who stood quietly holding her father's hand with the brass compass clutched in her other fist, and then looked back at David with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the assessing look from the valet stand, not the performance from the dinner table, but something unguarded. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know it was you. I want to be clear that doesn't excuse what I said to you, both nights. I was cruel to a man who saved my son's life 4 months before I ever insulted him, and I would have been just as cruel to him if he hadn't. That's the part that's been sitting with me. It wasn't about who you turned out to be. It was about who I decided you were standing in a vest holding a tray." She took a breath, the kind of breath people take when they've rehearsed something and still find it harder than expected. "I'm sorry. Specifically, I'm sorry for the comment about the wine stain, and I'm sorry for asking what you do, as if the answer would determine whether you deserved basic respect. You handled an exhaust fan failure in my kitchen with more composure than I've shown in some board meetings. And 4 months ago you pulled my son out of water that should have killed him and asked for nothing. I have spent my whole career being told I'm sharp. I was not sharp with you. I was small." David didn't say anything for a moment, the silence stretching just long enough to be uncomfortable. Not because he wanted her to suffer in it, but because he genuinely didn't know what the correct response was to an apology that large, delivered in front of a room of strangers and his own daughter. "I appreciate you saying that," he said finally. "I wasn't looking for an apology. I wasn't looking for anything, at the lake or in your kitchen. I do that work because it's what I know how to do, not because I want credit for it." He glanced down briefly at Caleb, who was watching the exchange with the focused seriousness children reserve for moments they sense are important even if they can't articulate why. "I'm glad he's all right. That's the only part that ever mattered to me." Victoria nodded, something easing slightly in her posture. "I'd like to do more than apologize. I run a company that employs structural and safety engineers. I'd like to offer you a position, a real one, not a courtesy. I've already had my chief engineer review what you did with that suppression system, and she said most certified technicians wouldn't have caught the secondary breaker option that fast. But I understand if you'd rather I just say thank you and leave it there." David looked down at Mia, who was looking up at him with an expression that mixed confusion and quiet pride, clearly piecing together that her father had once again, in his own quiet way, fixed something without telling her. He thought of the envelope on his kitchen table, the continuing education course he'd set aside without quite throwing away. "I'd be willing to talk about it," he said. "Properly. Not tonight." "Properly," Victoria agreed. "Tonight is just dinner." They stayed for the meal, though it bore almost no resemblance to either of the previous 2 nights. No performance, no audience to please, just a long table of people eating in a room that had, for one evening, stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. Caleb asked Mia about her compass twice, fascinated by the worn brass casing, and Mia explained, with the careful seriousness of a 7-year-old entrusted with something important, that it had belonged to her mother and that you were supposed to hold it flat and let it settle before you trusted what it told you. What if it's pointing somewhere you don't want to go? Caleb asked. Then you wait a little longer, Mia said. It usually settles somewhere that makes sense eventually. David, listening from across the table, said nothing, but something in his chest loosened that he hadn't realized was tight. He drove home that night with Mia asleep again in the back seat, the compass still loose in her hand the way it always was when she felt safe enough to stop holding it tightly. He carried her in, set her down, pulled the blanket to her chin, and this time, when she stirred and asked her half-conscious question, "Did you fix anything tonight?" He answered differently than he had 2 nights before. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I did." She smiled, already drifting again, and murmured something that might have been good or might have been nothing at all, and David sat with her another minute in the dark, the way he did most nights before going to the kitchen, sitting down at the small table and finally, without hesitating this time, opening the envelope from the continuing education program and reading it all the way through. Outside, the city kept its ordinary sounds. A distant siren, a passing car, the hum of a refrigerator that needed servicing he'd get to eventually. And David Connolly sat alone in his small kitchen under a single overhead light, holding a piece of paper that pointed, for the first time in a long while, somewhere he actually wanted to go.